There's a version of this city that doesn't exist anymore. Not the skyline, not the lakefront. The other Chicago. The one that smelled like steel and cigarettes and something frying on a griddle at 6 in the morning. The one where your block had a name, your corner had a bar, and everybody knew which family ran what. That Chicago didn't disappear overnight. It dissolved. Slowly. Quietly. And most people didn't even notice until it was already gone. These are 10 of the things we lost, and some of them, honestly, we're still trying to make sense of. Number 1, the factory jobs. You have to understand what a factory job meant in 1980s Chicago before you can understand what losing one did to a neighborhood. It wasn't just a paycheck, it was a shift, a schedule, a reason to wake up at 5 in the morning when it was still dark and 23 degrees outside. Inland Steel in East Chicago was employing roughly 18,000 workers at its peak. Wisconsin Steel on the southeast side collapsed in March of 1980, wiping out 3,300 jobs in a single weekend. No warning, no severance, no pension. Men who had worked that floor for 22 years showed up Monday morning and found the gates padlocked. That loss didn't just hit those workers. It spread through every tavern, every grocery store, every Catholic school on those blocks that depended on those wages. The factories weren't just buildings. They were the load-bearing walls of entire communities. When they closed, everything else followed. Number 2, the corner taverns. Every neighborhood had at least one. Some had 8. A corner tavern in Chicago in the 1980s wasn't a bar in the way people think of bars now. It was something closer to a community center that happened to serve old style on draft. You went there after the shift. You went there after Mass on Sunday. You went there when something went wrong at home and you needed to sit next to somebody who understood without you having to explain much. The jukebox played the same 12 songs. The bartender knew your name, your father's name, and approximately how much you could drink before you started saying things you'd regret. In Bridgeport, in Pilsen, in Hegewisch, in Avondale, these places anchored the block. Most of them are gone now. A few became wine bars. That's not a criticism. That's just the truth. Number 3, the old L ride. People romanticize the Chicago L now in a way that would have confused anyone who actually rode it every day in 1983. The loop elevated structure, the oldest sections of it dating back to 1897, was loud, freezing in January. And the platform smelled like something nobody wanted to identify. But it was alive in a way that's hard to explain. You learned the city by riding it. You learned which car to avoid. You learned that the red line at 2 in the morning was its own particular sociology experiment. You sat next to factory workers, nurses, students from the University of Illinois at Chicago, old Polish women carrying grocery bags, and guys who clearly had nowhere else to be. Nobody was looking at a phone. Nobody had a phone. You either looked out the window or you looked at each other. That forced intimacy created something. I'm not sure there's a clean word for it. Here's something that doesn't translate well to people who didn't grow up in it. In parts of Chicago in the 1980s, you didn't identify with your neighborhood by its name. You identified by your parish, not your church, your parish. There's a difference. The parish had the grammar school, the bingo night, the basement where the Knights of Columbus met, the gym where the CYO Basketball League played, St. Sabina on the south side, St. Stanislaus Kostka in Polish downtown, St. Michael's in Old Town. These weren't just religious institutions, they were the administrative unit of daily life. The parish boundaries mattered more to some people than the ward boundaries. When neighborhoods changed, when families moved out, when parishes consolidated, when schools closed, it wasn't just demographic change. It felt to the people living it like an erasure. Number 5, Wrigley Field. I want to be careful here because there's a version of this nostalgia that isn't honest. Wrigley Field in the early 1980s was a place where the Cubs lost consistently. The bleachers were basically lawless, and you could buy a ticket on the day of the game for less than what a parking spot costs now. The famous bleacher bums, the regulars in the left and right field bleachers, were a specific Chicago institution. Loud, loyal to the point of irrationality, deeply hostile to opposing outfielders. In 1984, the Cubs came within one game of the World Series, and the city went sideways with something that looked like joy but felt a little like grief, because by then, Cubs fans had trained themselves to expect the fall. The ballpark itself was still a neighborhood park. You could walk up. You could bring your own food. The ivy on the outfield wall was just ivy, not a brand. What replaced all that is objectively nicer. It's also completely different. If any of this is hitting close to home, if you lived this or your parents told you about it, don't forget to subscribe. Number 6. Maxwell Street. Maxwell Street ran along the near west side, and for most of the 20th century, it was the most chaotically alive street in Chicago. By the 1980s, it had been battered. Urban renewal had already taken chunks of it, but on Sunday mornings, it still operated as an open-air market unlike anything else in the Midwest. You could buy a used carburetor, a winter coat, a tamale, and a live chicken within one block. Blues musicians played on the sidewalk for tips. The smell of onions and grilled Polish sausage hung in the air from before dawn. Maxwell Street was where immigrants landed first: Jews, Greeks, Italians, and later African Americans from the Great Migration, and later still Mexicans from the South. It was a place where the city's economic bottom produced its own economy. The University of Illinois at Chicago demolished most of it in the early 1990s. A fragment of the street still exists, officially designated as a landmark. Walking it now is like visiting a grave. Number 7. Back of the Yards. The Union Stock Yards officially closed in 1971, but in the 1980s, that part of the Back of the Yards neighborhood still carried the memory in its bones. The smell was gone, mostly, but the infrastructure of a century of meat processing remained in the streets. The housing stock, the layout of the blocks. The families who had worked that industry for 3 generations were still there. Their grandchildren were still there. And the civic pride that had built out of that brutal, unglamorous labor, the labor Upton Sinclair wrote about in 1906 and got completely wrong according to every actual back-of-the-yards resident I've ever heard discuss it, was still present but starting to fracture. The neighborhood in the 1980s was dealing with unemployment, with gang activity, with the same forces eating at the south and west sides. But the identity forged in those stockyards, Eastern European, Mexican, working class, Catholic, tough, was still visible. You can still find traces of it, but you have to know where to look. Number 8. The Chicago Winter. This one isn't a place, it's a condition. A Chicago winter in the 1980s, before climate change had started softening the edges, was a different category of experience. The wind off Lake Michigan in January is not like cold anywhere else. It's a specific physics. It finds every gap in your coat. It makes the steel of the L-tracks contract and groan. The city's infrastructure was built by people who had learned to treat winter not as a disruption, but as the default state. Neighbors shoveled each other's sidewalks without being asked. Taverns were packed because home was cold, and the bar had a working radiator. There was a social cohesion that the cold enforced, which sounds insane until you've lived it. Winters now are still cold, but the winters of that decade had a different weight, and the communities that formed around surviving them had a texture that's hard to replicate in a more comfortable climate. Number 9. The projects. I'm going to say something that might complicate the nostalgia. The Robert Taylor homes, Cabrini Green, the Stateway Gardens. These are usually handled one of two ways in Chicago retrospectives, either as crime statistics or as romanticized communities of resilience. Both are real. Both are incomplete. The 1980s and the Chicago Housing Authority developments were the period when federal disinvestment, political neglect, and the deliberate concentration of poverty had reached their most destructive point. Families were living in buildings where the elevators did not work, where the heating failed in February, where the stairwells were genuinely dangerous after dark. And simultaneously, those buildings contained block clubs, church groups, women running informal daycares, men maintaining a sense of order on their specific floors. Both things were true at the same time. The buildings were demolished in the late 1990s and in the 2000s. The communities scattered. What replaced them is cleaner. Whether it was justice is a different question, and anyone who answers it quickly probably has not sat with it long enough. Number 10, Harold Washington's Chicago. This is the hardest one to explain. In the 1980s, Chicago was a city that had been through its industrial peak and had not yet figured out what came next. The lakefront was magnificent. The architecture was incomparable. But the neighborhoods were raw, contested, in motion. There was a feeling, maybe it was just youth, maybe it was the particular energy of a city in transition, that the story was not finished, that what happened on your block mattered, that a neighborhood could be saved or lost depending on whether the people in it decided to fight for it or leave. Harold Washington was elected mayor in 1983, the first black mayor in the city's history, and the coalition that elected him represented something real, a belief that the city's machine could be bent towards something more equitable. He died in office in 1987 at his desk in City Hall, and the grief that followed was not just personal. It felt to a lot of people like the closing of a door that had briefly been open. That Chicago still exists in pieces, in the taverns that somehow survived, in the parishes still standing on the south side, in the faces of people who remember what their block smelled like before the buildings came down. The city didn't disappear, it transformed. Sometimes transformation is progress, sometimes it's loss. Most of the time it's both at once, and you spend the rest of your life trying to figure out which feeling is more honest.